Memphis, 1957. The afternoon sun painted long shadows through the stained glass windows of First Baptist Church, casting kaleidoscope patterns across worn wooden pews and weathered hymnals. Sarah Beth Anderson stood before her grandmother's vanity mirror, carefully adjusting the blue ribbon in her golden hair. At 8 years old, she carried herself with a peculiar grace that seemed borrowed from someone much older. "Sarah Beth, honey, we need to leave soon," her mother called from downstairs, her voice carrying a hint of the anxiety that had become familiar since Grandma Rose's passing. Sarah Beth's fingers traced the embossed cover of her grandmother's Bible, its leather worn smooth by years of devoted reading. Inside, pressed between pages marked with careful notes, lay a treasured photograph. Grandma Rose standing proudly beside Elvis Presley after a Sunday service 3 years ago, back when he was just a local boy with big dreams and an even bigger voice. The last 3 months had been a blur of black dresses and casseroles, of whispered conversations and tear-stained cheeks. But today was different. Elvis Presley, now a rising star whose voice filled radio waves across the country, had agreed to speak at their church. Some said it was because of his friendship with Pastor Matthews. Others believed he needed to counter criticism about his devil's music. But Sarah Beth remembered how he used to sing in the choir, his voice soaring above the rest during Amazing Grace, Grandma Rose's favorite hymn. That morning, she had made a decision, the kind of decision that can only come from a child's heart, pure, unquestioning, and filled with the sort of faith adults spend lifetimes trying to recapture. She would ask Elvis Presley the question that had been burning in her heart since the day Grandma Rose left them. The church hall was already buzzing when the Andersons arrived. Ladies in their Sunday best fanned themselves with church bulletins while men stood in clusters, their conversations a low murmur beneath the crescendo of excitement. Sarah Beth clutched her grandmother's Bible tighter as she followed her mother to their usual pew, 3rd row from the front, gospel side. Margaret Anderson squeezed her daughter's hand. "You're awful quiet today, sweetheart. Everything all right?" Sarah Beth nodded, her eyes fixed on the empty podium. In her mind, she rehearsed the question again and again, the words becoming a prayer of their own. When Elvis finally appeared, the collective intake of breath was audible. He wasn't wearing his usual flashy attire. Instead, he had chosen a simple dark suit that reminded Sarah Beth of the one he wore in that old photograph with her grandmother. His hair, usually a carefully styled monument to rebellion, was combed more modestly, though still bearing his signature sweep. Pastor Matthews introduced him with the kind of warm familiarity that suggested their friendship wasn't just a rumor. Elvis approached the podium, his famous smile somehow more subdued in the sacred space. "It's good to be home," he began, his voice carrying that familiar Memphis drawl that had captured America's heart. "Mama always said you can't know where you're going unless you remember where you came from. And this church, these pews, these hymns, they're where I came from." As he spoke about his journey, about the struggle to balance his new life with his faith, Sarah Beth felt her heart beating faster. When the time came for questions, her hand shot up before she could second-guess herself. Elvis's eyes found her immediately, and something in his expression shifted. Later, people would say it was like watching a mask fall away, revealing something more real underneath. "Well, hello there, little lady," he said, his voice gentler than before. "What's your question?" Sarah Beth stood, her grandmother's Bible pressed against her chest like a shield. "Mr. Presley," she began, her voice clear despite her racing heart. "What does God mean to you? Because my grandma's gone now, and I'm trying to understand why he would take her when I still need her so much." The silence that followed her question was absolute. Even the usual creaking of the old church pews seemed to hold its breath. Elvis stepped away from the podium, moving closer to where Sarah Beth stood. In that moment, he wasn't the king of rock and roll, but rather the boy who used to sing in the choir, searching for his own answers to life's biggest questions. What happened next would change not only Sarah Beth's life, but Elvis's as well. setting in motion a chain of events that would touch countless lives and remind everyone present that sometimes the most profound truths come from the simplest questions. Elvis Presley stood before Sarah Beth, his usual confidence replaced by something more vulnerable. The afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows created a halo effect around them both, as if the very moment was being blessed. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, though somehow Sarah Beth felt he already knew. "Sarah Beth Anderson," she replied, then added, "My grandma was Rose Anderson." Recognition flickered across Elvis's face. "Miss Rose," he said softly, a smile warming his features. "She used to bring cookies to choir practice," said a voice like mine needed proper feeding. Sarah Beth nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "She kept your picture, the one from when you sang at Easter service 3 years ago. She said you had an angel's voice but a warrior's spirit." Elvis knelt down to her level, his eyes meeting hers. The entire congregation seemed to lean forward, drawn into the intimate moment unfolding before them. "You know, Sarah Beth," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed church, "I've been thinking a lot about God lately. With all that's happened, the fame, the money, the crowds, sometimes it feels like I'm losing my way. But your grandma, she understood something that took me years to learn." He gestured to the Bible in her hands. "May I?" Sarah Beth handed him the worn volume, and Elvis handled it with reverence, his fingers tracing the well-worn edges. "Miss Rose once told me that God isn't in the thunder or the earthquake or the fire. He's in the quiet moments, in the spaces between the notes, in the silence after the song ends." He opened the Bible carefully, finding a page marked with a pressed flower. "She showed me that music isn't just about the words or the melody. It's about the spirit behind them." As he spoke, Elvis began to hum softly, the opening notes of Amazing Grace. Sarah Beth recognized it immediately. It was a song her grandmother had sung to her every night before bed. Without planning or prompting, Sarah Beth's clear voice joined his, carrying the first verse. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." One by one, the congregation joined in, their voices rising in harmonious waves until the church itself seemed to vibrate with the power of their collective faith. Margaret Anderson wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her daughter sing, seeing a strength in the child she hadn't noticed before. When the last notes faded away, Elvis placed the Bible back in Sarah Beth's hands. "God means different things to different people, Sarah Beth. To some, he's a judge. To others, a friend. But your grandma taught me that God is like music. He's there in the joy and the pain, in the questions and the answers, in the harmony and the discord." He stood, addressing the entire congregation, but keeping his eyes on Sarah Beth. "Sometimes we think faith is about having all the answers, but maybe it's about having the courage to ask the questions. Your grandma knew that. She knew that doubt isn't the opposite of faith. It's part of it." Sarah Beth clutched the Bible closer. "But why did he take her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elvis's expression softened further. "I ask myself similar questions every day. Why did God give me this voice? Why did he put me on this path? But maybe, just maybe, the answer isn't in the why, but in the what now. What do we do with the love they left us? How do we carry their song forward?" As he spoke, something shifted in the atmosphere of the church. People who had come expecting to see a performance instead witnessed a transformation, not just in Elvis, but in themselves. The afternoon sun continued its journey across the stained glass windows, casting new patterns of light across the gathering, as if highlighting the truth in every word. The weeks following that fateful Sunday brought changes no one could have predicted. Elvis's honest conversation with Sarah Beth had struck a chord that resonated far beyond the walls of First Baptist Church. News of the exchange spread through Memphis like wildfire, carried on whispers and prayers, becoming something of a local legend. For Sarah Beth, life took on new meaning. She began spending her afternoons in the church choir room, teaching younger children the hymns her grandmother had taught her. Her mother watched with a mixture of pride and amazement as her daughter transformed grief into purpose. One particularly warm afternoon, as Sarah Beth was arranging sheet music for the children's choir, an unexpected visitor appeared in the doorway. Elvis Presley, fresh from a recording session at Sun Studio, stood watching her work. "Mr. Presley," Sarah Beth exclaimed, nearly dropping the stack of papers in her hands. He smiled, that famous grin somehow more genuine in the quiet of the empty choir room. "I heard you've been keeping the music alive, Miss Sarah Beth." She nodded, suddenly shy. "Grandma always said that teaching someone to sing is like teaching them to pray twice." Elvis settled onto the old piano bench, his fingers absently finding the keys. "Your grandma was a wise woman. You know, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, about faith and music, and all the questions we carry." He began playing softly, a melody Sarah Beth didn't recognize. "I've been working on something new, something different from my usual songs. Would you like to hear it?" For the next hour, Elvis shared with Sarah Beth his vision for a gospel album. He played fragments of songs, explaining how each one spoke to different aspects of faith, doubt, hope, redemption, and love. As he played, Sarah Beth found herself adding harmonies, her clear voice weaving through his deeper tones. "You've got a gift," Elvis said finally, his hand stilling on the keys. "Just like your grandma said you would." Sarah Beth looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" Elvis reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, slightly worn as if he'd been carrying it for some time. "Your grandmother wrote me this letter about a month before she passed. I think it's time you read it." With trembling hands, Sarah Beth opened the envelope and began to read. "Dear Elvis, I know my time is growing short, but there's something I need to ask of you. My granddaughter Sarah Beth has a gift, not just for music, but for seeing into people's hearts. She's going to need guidance when I'm gone, someone who understands that music and faith are two sides of the same coin. I've watched you grow from a boy with a dream into a man with a purpose, even if you sometimes forget what that purpose is. When the time comes and Sarah Beth begins to question everything, as all true believers must, I pray you'll be there to remind her that God speaks through music in ways words alone never can. Keep singing your truth, Elvis. And remember what I told you all those years ago. God gave you that voice not just to make music, but to heal hearts. With faith and love, Rose Anderson." As Sarah Beth finished reading, tears streaming down her face, Elvis began playing Amazing Grace once more. But this time it wasn't just a hymn. It was a bridge between past and present, between grief and hope, between a grandmother's love and a child's faith. 10 years later, 1967, the Fellowship Hall of First Baptist Church was once again filled to capacity, but this time for a different kind of gathering. Sarah Beth Anderson, now 18 and radiant in a simple white dress, stood before the congregation, her grandmother's Bible still in her hands. Elvis Presley sat in the front row, his presence causing the usual stir despite the solemnity of the occasion. He had taken a break from his busy schedule, movies, recordings, and concerts, to be here for what he considered a sacred moment. "When I was 8 years old," Sarah Beth began, her voice strong and clear, "I asked a question that changed my life. I asked Elvis Presley what God meant to him, because I couldn't understand why he had taken my grandmother away." She paused, looking around at the familiar faces. Some had been there that day. Others had only heard the story, but all knew its significance. Today, as I prepare to leave for Juilliard to study sacred music, I finally understand what my grandmother and Elvis tried to teach me. Faith isn't about having answers. It's about finding the courage to keep singing even when the music seems to fade. Elvis stood then, making his way to the old piano. Without a word, he began playing the introduction to a song, the same one he had shared with Sarah Beth in the choir room all those years ago. It had become the cornerstone of his gospel album, which had touched millions of lives. Sarah Beth's voice joined his, and together they sang. In the quiet of the evening, when doubts cloud my way, I hear her voice still singing, teaching me to pray. Through the music, through the silence, through the questions and the pain, faith flows like a river, bringing me home again. As they sang, something extraordinary happened. Members of the congregation began joining in, adding harmonies, creating a tapestry of sound that seemed to lift the very roof of the church. Margaret Anderson watched her daughter, tears streaming down her face, seeing in Sarah Beth's radiance a reflection of Rose's spirit. When the song ended, Elvis stood and embraced Sarah Beth. "Your grandma was right about you," he said softly. "You didn't just learn to sing, you learned to heal hearts." Sarah Beth clutched her grandmother's Bible, its pages now filled with new notes alongside the old ones. "And you kept your promise to her," she replied. "You helped me understand that sometimes God's greatest gifts come wrapped in our deepest questions." As the afternoon light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting familiar patterns across the gathering, Sarah Beth opened her grandmother's Bible one last time. There, pressed between the pages, lay two photographs, the old one of Elvis and Rose, and a newer one taken in the choir room, showing Elvis teaching a young Sarah Beth to play piano. The legacy of that Sunday afternoon in 1957 lived on not just in memories or recordings, but in the countless lives touched by the simple faith of a little girl who dared to ask a question, and the man who found his way back to his roots by answering it. Elvis went on to record more gospel albums, each one touching lives in ways as rock and roll never could. And Sarah Beth, through her work at Juilliard and beyond, continued to share the message that had transformed her life. That faith, like music, isn't about perfection. It's about touching hearts and healing souls. Years later, when asked about the turning point in his spiritual journey, Elvis would always point to that Sunday afternoon with Sarah Beth. "Sometimes," he would say, "God sends angels disguised as little girls with big questions to remind us of who we really are and why we're here." And in churches across America, the story would be told of how a little girl's question and a rock star's answer created a symphony of faith that continued to resonate through the years, touching lives and healing hearts, just as Grandma Rose had always known it would.